think you're still unmuted, Céline.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. So as said, today I want to present to you some of the findings of my PhD research, and of course the time does not allow me to go into great detail or tell you about everything that I did. So I want to give you some ideas that I worked about, and I look forward to more questions in the comment sections. I also indicated some literature on the slides for people who want to read a bit more. The Babylonian New Year Festival, I guess that when I talk about this festival, Babylonian New Year or Akitu Festival, one generally imagines one or more of the following things, namely that the festival had a fixed schedule of 12 days and that on every specific day, specific rituals took place. That it is one of the oldest recorded festivals in the ancient Near East, celebrated in one form or the other almost continuously from pre-Sargonic times until perhaps the early 3rd century of our era. That the most important event of the festival was the procession of king and god to the Akitu temple, which lay outside of Babylon's city walls, and this took place on the 8th day of the 1st month. And that during the first millennium, the ritual was related to the legitimation of kingship and the renewal of social order. Now, there are a number of problems that come with this general idea that we have regarding the Babylonian festival, but within the theme of today, cultural encounters, I decided to focus on one specific element, and that is the assumed continued observation of the festival until the end of cuneiform culture. Because as said, the New Year festival is a ritual of kingship. So why would it have been continued in a time of foreign domination? Now, the reason why people think this this ritual was still performed in the period in which there was no more king, so this is the Persian and Hellenistic period, is mainly because of this specific set of texts. These 7 manuscripts I called the New Year Festival texts, and they give instructions for the rituals to be performed from the 1st day of Nisanu, so the 1st month, to the 6th or 7th day of that month. The specific thing about these texts is that it is assumed that although we only have manuscripts from the Hellenistic period, so we can see that based on script and so on, that they were written down in the Hellenistic period, it is assumed that they are copies. So these temple ritual texts were copied during the Hellenistic period from older original compositions, is the assumption. Now, this has as a consequence that people have thought that the Babylonian cults practiced in the temples of Uruk and Babylon in the Hellenistic period were, as far as we can see in the sources, not different from those in the pre-Hellenistic times. So based on these specific ritual texts, mostly, there are some other texts that will come back to that later, people have claimed that the cults in the late Babylonian period were actually not so different than before the foreign rule came to be. So there is actually one problem with that. That is the fact that these texts have never been critically analyzed. So the first 2 texts have been published already in 1891, and the most recent edition of most of them dates to 2004. But still, the critical apparatus that comes with these texts, or just a critical edition of them, has never really been made, and therefore. This is what I ventured to do in my dissertation. And I actually analyzed the texts for 4 different aspects. And the first was language and orthography, which is where we should start as archaeologists working with texts. And what immediately came out of this analysis is that not only in the spelling, but also in words used and grammatical elements and so on, there is a clear late Babylonian influence. There are things that cannot be explained in light of earlier Babylonian language. One particular aspect of the language is that some of the terms used and some of the ways in which things are written relate strongly to how to the language used in astronomical texts. So it seems kind of, or it seemed that the language used in these texts had some influence from the sociolect of astronomers. So here already in the language and orthography, there was some clear late influence. Then this, I also studied the material aspects and paratextual notes of the tablets. You can see one of the colophons here on the photo. The colophons do not mention precursors, and there are also no precursors or no older versions of these texts known, which is one thing. Then it seems as if one of the manuscripts that we have is actually a draft. The quality is really bad. The structuring of the text on the tablet does not really work. There are a lot of mistakes. And then we have the finished duplicate. So we have drafts and finished texts in one library context, which would seem to bring us close to a moment of physical creation of a text. Then, of course, I studied the ritual that is described or prescribed in these texts. And although not the whole ritual is preserved, as you could see before, the texts are all very broken, we can discern several ritual sequences, which are divided by horizontal lines on the tablet. And none of these ritual sequences actually is known from older ritual texts, although they use some of the ritual syntax that we know from Mesopotamian rituals. There are clear innovations. There are rituals that do not occur. I will just give you an example on the next slide. And then the last aspect I studied was the matters of intertextuality. So these texts not only contain instructions for what to do, but also for what to say. So the prayers to be recited. And these prayers sometimes directly borrow from other compositions. And the only texts from which they borrow directly, so they cite, are late Babylonian texts, amongst which the mythical text called En-Meshar's Defeat. The myth of En-Meshara is well known from throughout Mesopotamian literary history, but this specific version on this tablet that has received the title En-Meshar's Defeat is only known in late Babylonian version. And then there's also one clear borrowing from the list of stars and deities, which is an astronomical commentary. So in conclusion, based on these analyses, which I have kind of flown over here, I don't have all the time to explain to you everything that I did. I concluded that these texts were not copies of earlier created versions, but that they were actually creations of the late Babylonian period, which means that these texts were originally composed in the late 4th to early 2nd century before our era. There's one example that illustrates this very well, I think, and it gathers several things, several elements of the different analyses, and that is the fact that every ritual sequence, every rite that has to be performed and that is described in these texts is to start at a specific moment of the day. Now, it is not so strange that Mesopotamian ritual texts specify whether ritual has to take place during the day or at night. This is important for ritual matters. But in these texts, it is very unique that there is this specific hour indication. So really time indications. And also not only the time indications themselves, I give you here some examples on the slide, but also the way in which they are written indicates that this is a new thing. It is an innovation of this time. For example, if you look at the first example, you don't even need to read the Akkadian. If you read the translation, it says in the month Nisan, second day, 1 double hour of the night. This is a kind of abbreviated formulation. And also the other examples are relevant because the clearest parallels that we can find for these time indicators are again in astronomical texts, such as the astronomical diaries. What is of specific interest is the way in which these texts are written. If you look at the second and third example, you see the word for day, umu, which is normally written with the sign ud, but it appears in late astronomical text as me, is written as me in the New Year Festival text. Also, the specific expression of umu ishka, written me nim a, is typically found in these late astronomical texts. So again, not only the fact that they are so specifically focused on time, which is an astronomical element after all, but also the way in which this written, which is very similar to astronomical texts, indicates again that these texts are late. But then the question is still why, because it doesn't answer the first question that I asked. So although it is now established that these texts were not copied, but actually created at a time of foreign domination, it is does still not explain, because after all, the king is one of the agents that appears in these texts. And why would these texts have been created in a time of foreign kingship in which there was no Babylonian king anymore? No, what I think is that the answer to this question lies actually exactly in the way the king and then the priest who performs the rituals is actually portrayed in this ritual. You can illustrate this very well with two specific fragments coming from these texts. The first one here on the slide is called the eulogy of the elder brother. And the words are put into Marduk's mouth, so the mouth of the god, and the god is eulogizing or blessing his priests, and they call him, they say that may they name you as the priest of my priest, and specific expressions like may the king humbly revere you, or may all the priests speak favorably of you. These words of reverence are normally only used to express reverence towards kings or gods, but not towards priests. So this is a very unique text. And then if we put this in contrast to another fragment of the New Year Festival text, which is the very famous scene of the ritual humiliation and negative confession of the king, then this becomes very clear. This is the second fragment on the slide, and what you see here is a ritual within these texts where it is said that the priest will remove the regalia of the king and strike him on the cheek, and he will pull him by the ears and make him kneel in front of the god, and then the king has to pronounce a confession of sins that is in these texts negated. So the contrast already between just these two specific fragments, in which on the one hand the priest is put as a kind of supernatural or super being in the eyes of the god, and then in the contrast to how the king is portrayed as a humbled and reverent person, is very specific, or is very illustrative, I find. And then the fact that there is this act of the striking of the king's cheek, this makes it most explicit, because it is said that the priest has to do this, has to perform this act. But it is also said multiple times within the ritual itself, but also within this eulogy, that the king may never do this to the priest. So the priest and the king are put on different in a different relationship to each other than we would normally see in Mesopotamian literature. Also, in fact, normally in Mesopotamian literature, the priest would not play a role. It is a king who is the highest human. But here we see a very different portrayal of both priests and king. And in fact, the New Year Festival texts are not the only texts that use these tropes of priests and kings and the god. There's actually a whole corpus of later Babylonian literature that was created at this time by the priests that revolves around different themes or motives that have to do with this triangular relationship between priests, kings, and the god. And all of them portray the priests as active agents. And this can mean that they are portrayed as heroes or even martyrs. They risk their lives for the preservation of the cult and the worship of the gods, for example. They are also presented as the guardians of cuneiform lore and rituals. So the rituals are secret and only the priests may see them. And only the priests have received the knowledge of cuneiform lore, and they have to protect it and perpetuate it. And as such, they are kind of presented as the chosen ones of Marduk. And in contrast to that, priests within these texts appear as very passive, almost stereotypical persons. So priests are either good, kings are either good or bad. So a good king does what he has to do, and that means that he protects Babylon and the priests of Marduk, and most importantly, he worships the god. But most of the kings that appear in this corpus are seen as bad, and this means that they do not revere the gods. And in that aspect, then the priests step up and risk their lives to warn the king that he has to take up this duty towards the gods. So we have this this dynamic between priest and king, where priests are actually almost assuming almost supra royal status, so they are put above the king almost. And whenever the king does not do what he has to do, which is worship the gods, the priests step up and either take over his tasks, or they warn him and urge him to take on his duties. Now, the specific corpora in which these motives appear are, first of all, the ritual text, so also these New Year Festival texts, but then also, and most explicitly, in historical literary texts, chronicles and the semi or pseudo prophecies. Like we know texts like the dynastic prophecy, there is the Marduk epic, there are the Kedorlaomer texts, and so on. All these texts relate to these specific topics. And the way in which these texts present these themes are also similar to one another. So they have these shared strategies of this antiquarianism. So they use specific old stories and tropes, but also kind of antiquated language to express things and authenticate what they are writing. But on the other hand, we have clear innovation in the language, in the form, and also in the fact that these priests are now the agents of this literature, which puts it in stark contrast to earlier literature again. Now, I think that is exactly within the context of that bigger corpus of late Babylonian priest literature that we can find then what the reasons are, or why these texts were created. So also the New Year Festival text, because it shows that it clearly relates to the historical context, so the socioeconomic and political context in which the priesthood that created these texts found itself. One of the most important things, or this focus on kingship and so on, relates to actually the real absence of Babylonian kingship, which is the result of not only the Persian conquests, but then certainly of the disruptive events of 484 BCE. And even though with the arrival of Alexander the Great and the first Seleucids, who showed more interest and support for local temple communities, things got a little better. Then the removal of that support in the first half of the 2nd century BC must have been again a dramatic moment for the priesthood. So we have this dynamic situation of absence of kingship, which is a very important aspect for the cult and the continuation of the cult and the livelihood of the priesthood, the loss of centrality of Babylon within the empire. And then with the first Seleucids, this renewed royal interest, and then later again its removal. So again, this very clear absence of kingship for which there had been some hope just before. I think in this context, we can explain, or by this, we can explain why these texts were created at this time and with these specific topics. And in that context, it also served specific purposes. So because they relate to this priestly agency, which is certainly a thing that relates to their reality, they now had to take on many tasks that were previously performed by the Babylonian king, and now they had to take them upon themselves. So they had to authenticate their role, they had to authorize their role, and they had to strengthen this new priestly identity, but also their ancient priestly identity that came with their ancient values. The ancient values relating to kingship are most clearly also a mirror of princes. So even though the literature does not directly address kings as such, except in the case of Berossos, who wrote in Greek and addressed actually Antiochus in his work, even though this might be indirect in most cases, it's clear that they kind of they have this expectation of how kings should act that fits with their traditional idea of Babylonian kingship. And it is exactly also this incongruity between what they are living in their presence, So this disinterest of the king and their new role that conflicts with their aspirations and their traditions, and with this literature they can perhaps deal better with this incongruity. So it shows how they are dealing with it. Now, one thing that is also important to note is that there are other late Babylonian sources that are used to talk about the New Year Festival at this time, in which there was no Babylonian king. These are mostly astronomical diaries and chronicles. And although it is mostly assumed that these texts are quite neutral and contain correct historical facts, we should also beware of the fact that these texts also contain a bias, because they were created by the same people who wrote these historical texts and these ritual texts, which have these specific purposes and interests that revolve around priesthood and kingship. If you take, for example, one of the most important sources for the performance of the New Year Festival in the Hellenistic period, we can actually see this happening in a sense. So this text reads that in the first month Nisanu, on the 8th day, King Antiochus III and some of his officials went out from the palace, and he went to Cassicula, the great gate of Esangila. And there the Shatamu of Esangila performed the Haru of the year before them. And then there were more offerings in another temple and to Mesopotamian gods and so on. Now, this has often been taken as a reference to the Akitu procession, so the procession that took place during the New Year Festival, because what is described here is the 8th day, which is normally the day on which the procession would go to the temple. Now, this is not what's happening here, but because there is no reference to a procession. But one thing that does occur is the Haru. The Haru is a ritual that is in the first millennium. It's not entirely clear what it means or what it entails, but this Haru was traditionally performed by the king at the new year. Now, it was also probably performed at other instances of the year, but it's less relevant. But it was a ritual that was performed by the king. Now, here, actually, it is not the king who performs that ritual, but the Shatamu, which is the high priest. And he does not do that because the king cannot do it. He actually does it in the presence of the king. So this results in a kind of absurd situation. This is a description of an absurd situation in which a king is present at a royal ritual, but does not perform it. So to me, this is not an account of the Babylonian New Year Festival as we know it from earlier times. It is clearly an account of how things have changed, of how things are different. And this is generally the case in the astronomical diaries and in these chronicles in which specific data was selected to then be written down in these texts. And that meant that they used specific criteria to write things down, which is clearly a focus on actions that happened within Babylon and Esangila, but also a very close focus or a close attention for the person of the king. Because even though the king is not so often in Babylon, his person is often mentioned in these texts, and he is often mentioned in a context in which he's doing what a Babylonian king is supposed to do, which means he's either fighting enemies who have archaic names like Gutians or Elamites, or he is shown as performing offerings or being present offerings in this case. And then another thing is that perhaps they also record events that took place on days which relate to historically important moments. Like in this case, they chose this event of the 8th day of Nisanu specifically because it had been the moment on which this procession had happened. But now there is no record of this in this. So in that sense, we should also be aware of these other texts that were created at this time, which we often consider to be more neutral. In that sense, I want to speak about the New Year Festival between real and ideal, because even though we have these specific texts and sources, we have to be clear about what they are actually telling us and how we actually can use them to talk about the festival. Certainly in the late Babylonian period, in a time in which there was no longer a king on the throne in Babylon, at least not a Babylonian king or someone who conformed to that idea. And so the ritual texts, they kind of or they are kind of a means for the priesthood to deal with this absence of the king on the one hand, and this ideal of Babylonian kingship and how and Babylonian kings and how they should act towards Marduk. So especially these specific rituals that relate to the king and the slapping of the king and so on, they kind of are a direct way of dealing with this. So they form a bridge between this real and ideal situation. By that I don't mean to say that I think this was performed. I don't think this specific ritual was performed at this time or at any time. But what I do think is that there was some kind of performance or some kind of ritual that was still observed at the beginning of the year, because it was such a crucial moment, but that it had just taken on a different form. And then on the other hand, so as I said, we should beware of the primary sources too of that time, because they have this inherent emphasis on the elements of continuity. But by doing that, by emphasizing whatever seems to be continuity with what came before, they actually focus on what has changed. So because if you look at these texts, what becomes very clear from them is the absence in the foreigners and actually the indifference of the reigning kings and just generally the changes that took place at this time. And in that sense, and I won't speak indeed about the New Year Festival between real and ideal, both in the late Babylonian period, but also in modern research and how we should do when we talk about this festival. Thank you very much for your attention.